John Bradamus, former congressman and now president of New York University, was on the Ball State University campus to deliver the 12th annual Stephen J. and Beatrice Bradamus Lecture. He gave us his views on international education. Dr. Bradamus, is there a relationship between international exchanges between universities and international trade? And if so, how does one affect the other?
I'll give you one example that may, by illustration, make the point. New York University has just created a center on Japanese business and economics as part of our Graduate School of Business Administration. And one of the reasons we want to do that is that the relationship in terms of trade, business, investment, the economic and political relationship between the United States and Japan will be, whether we like it or not, something with which we'll be living the rest of our lives. And it's an enormously important relationship. But there are very few places in this country where this highly volatile set of relationships can be analyzed, discussed in a thoughtful, objective sort of way. We hope to provide that opportunity because, to illustrate my point further, there may be, according to a report of a few years ago, some 10,000 Japanese businessmen working in our country who speak English, whereas in Japan there may be only a relative handful of American businessmen working full-time, most of whom do not speak Japanese. The Japanese have clearly better prepared themselves through their universities to work and do business in this country and to compete with the United States than we Americans have in working at our universities to prepare our business leaders to compete effectively with the Japanese. That's just one direct example of the important nexus between effective competition in the United States with other countries and universities.
And in essence, you feel it's the university setting that would allow some of these problems to be settled?
Oh, there's no question, no question about it. Obviously, a good deal of training goes on in business and industry proper, but there's a very important role for our universities to educate people to be able effectively to work in international trade. We simply don't give enough attention to pursue the point in the United States and our universities to preparing people in knowledge of modern foreign languages and in the knowledge of other peoples, their politics, their culture. One of the reasons, to go still further, that I believe we got into so much trouble in Vietnam and in Iran is that we did not, as a nation, have enough knowledge in depth of the politics, the culture, the history of those parts of the world. And so we made very serious miscalculations that in fact cost our country human life, much treasure, and much internal discord. And we're still paying the price of that ignorance of other peoples and other cultures, particularly of the non-Western world.
To expand on that further, can exchanges between countries with deep philosophical, religious, and political differences really work?
Oh, I think so. As a matter of fact, you may be interested to know that I spent a month this summer in the People's Republic of China as one of a group of 7 or 8 American university presidents who went to Beijing and elsewhere in China to meet with our Chinese counterparts to talk about the possibility of expanding such exchanges. Now, when I was a member of Congress, I led the first delegation to China during the Carter administration, and I can tell you, that was in 1977, that the difference in tone that my colleagues and I found in 1985 from what my congressional colleagues and I found in 1977 is enormous. Then all the Chinese wanted to talk about in the aftermath of the Cultural Revolution and following the death of Mao was the smashing of the Gang of Four and when will Deng Xiaoping return. This time These Chinese university presidents didn't talk politics, they didn't talk about Marx, they didn't talk about ideology, they didn't talk about Mao. What they talked about was, how do you run a first-class university? How do you choose deans? What kind of relationships do you have with your faculty? And Mr. President, they said to me, can you at New York University send us some professors who know about public administration, computer sciences, and business administration? So we're going to explore those possibilities. I think there can be no doubt that though the Chinese have a political and social system, an economic system, very different from ours, that we can enter into exchanges that will prove mutually advantageous to our countries.
Along the same lines, what are the obligations of higher education institutions toward helping state and national economies?
I think they are considerable. I'll respond by telling you two anecdotes. I was the congressman in South Bend, Indiana, over 20 years ago when the Studebaker plant was shut down overnight in my hometown, with several thousands of people out on the street. I worked very hard with President Johnson and others to help bring in new industry, and we did bring in what is now known as AM General up there, which has brought in billions of dollars in government work over the years. But I noted, as a result of that experience, how the business leaders of northern Indiana and southern Michigan failed, in my opinion, to forge effective links with research universities in Indiana and Michigan in order to develop economic activities different from, in addition to, the automotive industry. We were putting all our eggs in the Midwest in the basket of the automotive industry. In my judgment, I think we still do too much of that, because if the auto industry should take a nosedive in the years ahead, there we are again, strung out, overly dependent on that particular economic activity. What we ought to be doing, in my judgment, is on the part of business, industry, government at every level, and the university world, is figuring out ways how universities can work more carefully with business and industry to make research facilities more relevant to the 20th century, increasingly pointing to the 21st century, so that we're not doing our thinking with our eyes looking behind, but looking forward. Now, I have been asked by Governor Mario Cuomo of New York, in my new state, to chair the New York State Council on Fiscal and Economic Priorities. And one of the items on the agenda of this council, which is composed of 24 outstanding figures in New York State, is to develop suggestions for the governor on precisely the point you've made. How can universities contribute to the economic development of the state of New York? One of the areas, for example, that we're going to discuss with the governor is more support for scientific and technical centers to develop new modes of economic activity that will produce jobs and will be highly competitive. So I think there's a very direct connection. The future of the United States in economic terms is overwhelmingly dependent on how willing we are to invest in brain power.
Higher education institutions play a major role in developing and preserving the arts and humanities. How will this role change if education receives less funding from public and private sources?
Well, it will be more difficult, clearly. And as you may know, when I was a member of Congress, I chaired for 10 years or so the subcommittee of the House of Representatives with jurisdiction over the arts and humanities endowments. So I had a particular interest in both those areas, and this year we marked the 20th anniversary of the creation of these two endowments. Before these two endowments were established, in most states of the country you did not have a state arts council or a state humanities endowment, and Marty Schwartz of Muncie here gives great leadership to the Indiana State Humanities Council. But we've seen a big push forward in both those areas, in large part stimulated by the cooperation, by the partnership that they authorized. President Reagan, to my great distress, is the first president of the United States, Republican or Democrat, to have decided to declare war on the arts and humanities, and he tried in his first budget to reduce by half the contribution of the federal government for both those purposes, and he's tried repeatedly in each of his succeeding budgets to attack these two programs, but I'm pleased to say that both Republicans and Democrats in Congress have said, no, Mr. President, we regard these programs as important to the quality of life in the United States. I'd add that part of the genius of the two endowments has been to stimulate through a matching grant program, a challenge grant program, greater contributions to the arts and humanities from private business and industry and foundations. So there has been a great push forward as a result of their creation.
Speaking of budgets and taxes, the proposed changes in the tax system would affect all universities, public and private. We'd like your views on the legislation and what areas would be most affected: research, private gifts, and so forth.
Well, let me give you a couple of reasons I think the tax bill now under consideration in the House Ways and Means Committee holds out great dangers for education at every level in this country. Let me mention just two or three parts of it. First, the proposal by President Reagan and the House Ways and Means Committee staff to eliminate deductibility of state and local taxes from federal taxes is a very damaging blow at local public school systems in every public school district in the United States, because, as you know, we rely heavily on local taxes to support our public school system. If taxpayers are no longer permitted to deduct from their federal tax what they pay in local taxes, not to say state taxes, that will be a disincentive for local communities to continue to provide adequate local tax revenues to support their local public school system. A second major attack on education in the bill would be to deny universities like New York University, Ball State University, the capacity to receive contributions from private donors of what is known as appreciated property. For example, if you decided to give to Ball State University a piece of stock for which 10 years ago you paid $10,000 and today is worth $50,000, today you can take a deduction of $50,000. Mr. Reagan wants to tell you, no, you can only take $10,000. That change would work great hardship on museums, libraries, colleges, universities that depend very importantly on gifts of appreciated property. The third area of attack that bothers me very much is a change that would deny access to private colleges and universities like New York University, Notre Dame, St. Mary's College, Goshen College in my old congressional district. The proposed change would deny the opportunity to private colleges and universities to borrow on the tax-exempt market in order to build classrooms, dormitories, research facilities, while continuing such access to the tax-exempt market to state universities, public universities. Now, when I was in Congress and was writing the Guaranteed Student Loan Program, for example, we did not say that if you get a guaranteed loan, you may study only at a state university and you can't take that loan and go study at a private university. Never did we say that. We regarded the pluralistic system of American higher education as vital to our kind of free and open and pluralistic society. The federal government, during my 22 years of service in Congress, supported by both Republicans and Democrats in the White House and in Congress, said we will treat both public and private colleges and universities on a par, equally. This proposed change would disrupt that long-standing tradition. I'm very distressed, therefore, and there are other parts of the tax bill that also represent an almost savage attack on education. And I don't know that my old colleagues in the House of Representatives really are aware of the damage that they would do to education by passing the Reagan bill or the House Ways and Means Committee staff proposal. So I'm hopeful that people who are within the sound of my face and voice will take a look at what this tax bill would do to education if they care as deeply as I do about education, and let their representatives in Washington know. I've had a very good conversation with my very dear friend and former colleague, Congressman Andy Jacobs of Indianapolis, who was on the House Ways and Means Committee, and who I think has a very keen appreciation of the importance of education to the future of our country. And I hope he is going to be helpful in preventing this very, very dangerous development from taking place. Now, according to the newspaper and the television reports this week, Senator Dole, the Republican leader of the Senate, has indicated there is no likelihood that the Senate will actually act on a tax reform bill in this calendar year. As you know, the Senate will not be able to in any event unless the House passes a bill. Whether the House Ways and Means Committee will be able to complete action on a bill and the House vote on it and pass it remains to be seen.
You mentioned talking with Congressman Jacobs, Andy Jacobs. Will you actively lobby for defeat of some of these parts of the bill?
I've already been to Washington and talked to a number of my former colleagues in Congress, and I must say, and I've talked to a number of members of the Ways and Means Committee, I must say that I find none of them enthusiastic about approval of the bill.
What do you think the chances are of passage with the domination of the Democrats?
Well, we'll know better. We'll know better in a few days. Indeed, I don't know when our interview is going to be aired, but I believe the Ways and Means Committee will be working even this weekend on the bill, and so probably on Monday we'll have a clearer picture of the outlook. Right now, the bill seems to be losing support. I noted that a few days ago the roundtable, the business roundtable, which is composed of some of the leading business executives in the United States, indicated great unhappiness with the way the bill is developing. And I know that a number of state and local officials, because of the elimination of deductibility, are very hostile to the bill. So I would say that its prospects are dimmer today than was the case a few months ago. Having said that, I think it's too early to pronounce it dead, and I think that taxpayers in their individual capacities and people who have the responsibility, as I do, of leading a university must pay very careful attention to it, because inadvertently, in the desire to lower tax rates, particularly from what I can judge, for the richest people in our society, the Congress and the President could do very great damage to middle-income taxpayers, to colleges and universities, to public schools, to hospitals, to libraries, to all kinds of public purpose activities in our country.
Reginald Wilson, Director of the Office of Minority Concern, American Council on Education, Washington, D.C., also spoke on the Ball State campus about the importance of and benefits of attracting minority students to universities. Mr. Wilson, why is it important for universities to attract minority students?
Universities are a part of American life, I think, to begin with. And since American life is made up of a variety of different kinds of people throughout all walks of life, that universities ought to reflect that diversity just like other walks of life. In our society, 12% of the population is black, 6% is Hispanic, 2% is Asian American, 2 additional percent are Native Americans and Alaskans and Hawaiians. That's the way our universities ought to look, because that's the way our population looks. When we find that our universities, as they now look, predominantly white, predominantly middle class, we are in actuality having an elitist or an exclusive society in which only some people have access to education and others do not. If our universities are to be truly democratic and to reflect American society, they ought to also look like those groups that I described.
Not only is it morally right to attract minorities to universities, but there are also advantages to it.
Certainly there are advantages. I would begin with simply the economic advantage. One of the things that demographic projections tell us is that the white youth population is declining because of the lower birth rates of 10 years ago, and they will not pick up again until toward the end of the century. On the other hand, minority populations are increasing because the birth rates among blacks and Hispanics are the highest in the United States. As a consequence, those persons coming into 18 and 19-year-old college-going ages are predominantly minorities. If we don't bring them into the higher education arena, in actuality, the size of our university populations are going to decline. And administrators and professors who are concerned about maintaining their jobs, maintaining the economy of the institution, are going to have to go out and get what we now call non-traditional students. Those non-traditional students are fast going to become the traditional students of the next decade.
There are several things that stuck with me in listening to you speak to the Ball State group. And one, of course, that it's cheaper to educate than incarcerate.
That's right. It's a truth that it's very hard to learn, primarily because Americans generally, when they try to solve legal and social problems, look for short-term solutions. When we found that Sputnik was going around the Earth and the Russians had beat us in space, we immediately poured millions of dollars into educating kids as scientists. That's our idea of short-term solutions. But we had not thought years before then that a good number of countries in the world were passing us by in science and that we should have started a long time ago. Now that we've caught up in that arena, we're not pushing it as fast. Indeed, what is happening is that in some arenas we're educating too many people in various fields. Everybody thought, for example, that the next wave of occupations were going to be in computer sciences. We're now turning out too many computer scientists, and there are going to be more persons than the field could absorb. So we go at these short-term solutions. What we need to do, what other countries are doing, is doing more long-range planning in terms of what the country ought to look like 20, 30 years from now, and start planning now on doing that kind of thing. So when we talk about the populations of colleges and universities being different, we ought to start doing some planning about that now. If we don't, what we might very well find, at least as our demographic figures indicate, is that we're excluding minorities from education. 20 years down the line, we will pay for that because we will either find them in low-paying jobs, not able to pay taxes into the economy, or we will find them committing crimes and we will be putting them in jails, and it will cost us $15,000 a year to keep a person in jail when it costs us $5,000 to educate them in a college and university. If we do that long-range planning and look 20 or 30 years down the line, we can save billions of dollars in the United States by taking advantage of that and looking at it purely from economic self-interest. Has nothing to do with whether we feel it's right or wrong. We need to do something about it now. But the only way we can do that is to do some long-range planning.
Another point you made surprised me, and I checked it out, and it was accurate, and that was that 50% of the college students today are over 25 and have part-time jobs.
Yes.
And I checked that out with our people, and it is true.
Yes. This campus does not reflect that. That's why it's probably hard to perceive that. The kind of figures that I share with you are those that we gather at the American Council on Education, which represents the national picture. And the national picture is quite different. In the national picture, it's not your typical 18-year-old middle-class white student right out of high school who is going to college or university. If we look around the country, what we're finding are mothers who have had their first children who are returning to college. We're finding persons who worked in dead-end occupations who are now coming back to pick up a second career. That is more and more typical of what college and university life will be like. We used to call that continuing education, and we used to call that adult education. It was something that we did on the side while regular higher education was here. What I was suggesting this morning, and what the figures are beginning to show, is that what we call non-traditional education is more and more becoming the traditional education of today. But we haven't adopted our thinking in colleges and universities to reflect the fact that more and more people who are coming to college are 25 years old, part-time, maybe have a family, and are trying to establish a second career. That's more and more going to be typical of the wave of the future. We need to be prepared for it.
Where does the initiative come? Does it come from the administration? Does it come from the government? Where?
Some of those institutions that I think are pretty far-seeing, who can look far enough into the future, have gotten a grasp on it. And they began getting in on the ground floor some time ago. They're the ones that are not experiencing enrollment declines, for example. They're the ones that got in on the movement of continuing education, extension education, and what have you. For example, Wayne State University in Detroit has a labor studies program, one of the largest in the country, What they found was they had a cadre in the city of Detroit of 200,000 auto workers who had built into their contracts the requirement that the Ford, GM, and Chrysler Corporation pay their education benefits if they went to school. Less than 1% of auto workers were going to school. And what Wayne State University did was to establish a labor studies program geared directly at auto workers. And they held classes in the union halls, in the plants, and the industries reimbursed the universities for their education. Wayne State is cleaning up millions of dollars in this arena. Other universities don't even think of auto workers in the plant as being college students. So I'm saying you have to be on the cutting edge. I think in many respects the administrations of colleges and universities have got to take the initiative. Wayne State at one time had 30,000 students. At the time that they began to look around and see where their student body was, they had 20,000 students. They're now back up to about 25,000 students. But what they did was to take the initiative to say, we are going out after the non-traditional students. We're going to market that. We're going to make our university attractive to them. They even developed another degree. They called it a Bachelor's of General Studies, which was for students who wanted to come back and get a college education and not necessarily be an engineer or a doctor or a lawyer, but who want to go to college. There are lots of folks like that who want to have a college degree to say, I went to college. And so the Bachelor of General Studies at Wayne State is for people who want a college degree. And there are thousands of people in southeastern Michigan who want to do that. And they have something like 20 to 30 extension centers around southeastern Michigan where people can earn a degree from Wayne State without having to come to the central campus, without having to give up a full-time job, without having to go to school full-time. I think it's institutions that are getting on the cutting edge of that are really the wave of the future. And I think many other institutions are going to have to take that initiative.
By attracting the minority student, it's beneficial to the student.
The non-traditional. I'd rather say non-traditional, because we're not just talking about minority students. We're talking about mothers whose kids have grown up and now they are saying, what do I do next? We're talking about people who are, as I mentioned, the auto workers, most of whom are white, by the way. You've got a whole group of auto workers who, when the automobile industry automated, without going too far afield, the competition with the Japanese, in order for us to catch up, we had to automate most of the automobile industry. You have a lot of auto workers who are out of work in Michigan who will never be employed again. And they say, what can I do? I spent 20 years on the line moving nuts and bolts from one end to the other. Now they're saying, I can go back to school, earn a degree, and start another career. So I'm talking non-traditional. Non-traditional happens to include a lot of minorities, but non-traditional is not just minority.
Don't we have to also change our thinking concerning financing? Because most of it is geared to the traditional student, 18, 19 years old, just entering school.
Yes.
Isn't it more difficult for the non-traditional student to get financing?
To some degree, yes, and to some degree, not. What you have is, in a sense, a secret cache of money that's available in some instances. One instance I pointed out is that union contracts often have tuition reimbursement credits. We have it at the American Council on Education. We promote upward mobility for our staff. Our secretaries can go to college and get college credit, and our organization will reimburse them for taking those classes. We have had secretaries at the American Council who got a college degree and became office managers, and who went from office managers to becoming professional assistants in their offices. We have one of the directors of our program who has now a PhD in education and directs one of ACE's programs, who started as a secretary in the company. All of her education was financed by the company by tuition reimbursement. Many companies have those plans. Insurance companies have them. Banks have them. We have had persons return to college who are working as tellers in banks to learn finance and accounting so that they can move up in the hierarchy. There are many kinds of wells of money that will reimburse people for education if we seek it out. It's not all coming from scratch. We don't have to just depend on the state. So that I think we have to be creative in identifying the kind of money that's available to reimburse people for education, and there's a good deal of it, and exploit it. But I think that universities that want to seek that out, they will find there are a lot of caches of money that do not have to generate new funds, but that are available right now.